Let me just highlight that today we're going to talk about taxes and subsidies. Next week, we're going to talk about import tariffs. We're going to talk about price ceilings, price floors, price supports, all sorts of different things that governments do that affect markets. And we're going to look at what the implications or the effects of those different types of interventions are likely to be. Now, I will highlight, I'll mention this up front, I think I'll come to it again in a few slides, that we're going to be assuming that the markets are perfectly competitive. And we're going to analyze the effects of these different policies in light of that. Now, we'll relax that assumption from time to time, and we're going to see how things can change when markets are not always perfectly competitive. But there'll be just a few diversions with respect to that. So let me give you a couple of definitions. First, what is a tax? Tax is a government fee collected from individuals or businesses, and it could be a tax based on the ownership of something like property, or the income that you're receiving on your wages, or some other specified action, like you're importing a product from abroad and you might have to pay a tax or a tariff on a particular thing. Right? So governments are very creative and have come up with all sorts of ways to tax us in a multitude of different ways. And I'll give you a list of some of those in a minute. A subsidy is a government payment, and it's made, again, to individuals or businesses, and it also is going to be based on ownership of something or the income that's receiving or some specified action. And we're going to be talking about things like production subsidies. They'll pay you something if you produce a particular thing, and that's something that governments do from time to time. Now, a couple of different types of taxes and subsidies. Okay, so taxes, if you say, well, what are taxes in the United States economy? It includes things like income taxes, which is probably the biggest collector of taxes in the national economy. You've got property taxes, which are very important for the states. You've got Social Security taxes, which, by the way, if you add income and Social Security taxes, that's most of the money that gets taken out of people's paychecks. And it makes up the bulk of government revenue that comes into the federal government. You've got sales taxes. Sales taxes are mostly only implemented by the states, and that's a way in which the states collect money. There are profit taxes. There are import taxes, or also called tariffs. There are commodity taxes on alcohol and cigarettes and gasoline and things like that. And there's, I'm sure, a whole variety of other types of taxes that people might be subject to. Right? So the governments have come up with lots of different ways to collect money from its citizens. Subsidies. Where do we see subsidies? One of the big areas of subsidies is in agriculture. And in fact, the agricultural industry gets in the US somewhere around $60–70 billion worth of subsidies every year. And that's built into the federal budget, right? And that's a big area where subsidies are provided. Energy companies, like oil companies, they get subsidies too, which has been subject to some discussion in the presidential campaign about whether we really ought to be giving oil companies energy subsidies, especially in light of climate change problems. Housing subsidies are provided. Often lower interest rate loans might be provided to lower income individuals. There are healthcare subsidies that are provided, and that can include things like Medicare and Medicaid that actually provide health insurance, if you will, for poor or the elderly. There are export subsidies to help promote exports of certain products. There's a lot of different ways in which the government comes in and says, tell you what, we'll pay you to do something, and try to encourage certain types of activities with those subsidies. All right. Taxes and subsidies can be implemented in two basic ways. First way is something called an ad valorem tax or subsidy. And this is just a percentage tax on the value of something. Okay, so it could be sales taxes, for example, are an ad valorem tax. In Virginia, I think it's like 5% of sales or something like that. In New York, maybe it's 9% of sales, something. And so you look at the value of your receipt, and then you add on a certain percentage, and that's the money that goes to the local government. Or percentage of import value, or percentage of profit, and so forth and so on. And we usually talk about taxes as percentages of something. So it's a typical way to assess a tax. There's another way to assess a tax or a subsidy, which is called a specific tax or subsidy. And this is going to be assessed as a dollar charge per unit of the good. So for example, we do in the United States have a tariff on imports of tomatoes that amounts to 3.9 cents per kilogram of tomato import. So it's measured on weight of the tomatoes being brought in, and then there's a dollar charge per that weight. Or the federal government has a gasoline tax in place, which is, I looked it up, it's 18.3 cents per gallon today. Right? So each gallon of gasoline has an extra 18 cents attached to it because the federal government is collecting a tax. You don't really know that because it's not really reported, or you don't see it at the pump when you actually fill up your tank with gas, but it's in there. It's being paid. And like before, tax or subsidy can be assessed on the amount produced, the amount consumed, or the amount traded. So you can apply it to different aspects of the production or exchange process. And that's often done, and we're going to talk about the distinction about that today. Now, purpose. Why are taxes and subsidies used? Taxes, the primary purpose really is to collect revenue. Okay, taxes date from time immemorial because government operations require funding, and you have to fund it somehow. One way to do that is with taxes collected from the citizens of the country. So this is perhaps the primary and most important reason for having taxes. Now, and that's a good example of why we have income taxes, for example. It's to pay for the federal government and for the way and the things that it's doing. Now, when we analyze taxes coming up in a minute, I am not going to be considering what the revenue is being used for, except that we're going to measure its value. But government is there to provide for certain types of public goods. For example, they're there to create a justice system, to have a police and a military that protects us from theft and protects the enforcement of contracts. That's a very important mechanism, institution that's necessary to keep our markets functioning and working effectively. But in order to make the justice or judicial system work, we need to have tax collection in order to pay or fund those particular activities. Okay, that's obvious. The secondary reason for having taxes, though, is to discourage something from taking place. And so for that reason, we have taxes on pollution emissions. We have taxes on cigarette consumption, for example. We have taxes on alcohol. Those are so-called sin taxes to try to prevent or encourage more positive behavior on the part of individuals. We've had tax suggestions for things like soft drinks in New York City, right? To try to get people to eat healthier or consume healthier products. And so there's all sorts of suggestions and discussions about using taxes to try to discourage people from doing certain things. Well, what's the reason for subsidies? Is usually the opposite. You're not collecting any money with subsidies. And in fact, so it's not a revenue thing. So the only reason for using a subsidy is really to encourage something to happen. So you want more solar energy? Provide subsidies. You want housing for low-income individuals? Provide subsidies. And the government engages in this quite broadly. Okay, our analysis. We're going to do something a lot simpler. Too many types of taxes implemented in too many ways, having too many potential effects upon the economy. So we're going to just focus on a simple tax and subsidy. And I suggest you take a public finance course in economics if you're interested in learning more about different types of tax policy, subsidy policies, the government role, how they do their business. And what we're going to do is we're going to consider a simple specific tax and a specific subsidy assessed per unit, that's a specific tax or subsidy, on a particular good that's traded in a market. So it's going to be very much like an alcohol or a gasoline tax that gets imposed. It's on a particular product. Government is saying we're going to charge so many cents or so many dollars per unit that gets sold in the marketplace. There's a variety of taxes out there like that, and we're going to use that to just see how does that tax or subsidy affect the outcome in a particularly perfectly competitive market. Right? But those are going to be very similar. Like, for example, we're going to see that a tax is going to discourage that behavior. And we're going to see that a subsidy encourages that behavior. And that's going to be true whether it's a property tax or whether it's an income tax or whether it's going to have those kinds of effects regardless of how or where you're setting that tax or subsidy. All right, so we're going to get a lot of insight on this nonetheless. Okay, do you see price and quantity effects of a production tax? All right, first what we're going to do is we're going to consider alternatively two different ways of implementing a tax in a particular market. In the first instance, we're going to say, let's suppose that the tax is applied on production of the good. So we're going to go to the producers producing this good and say, hey, you're producing this good, we're going to charge you a tax for each unit you produce. And then afterwards, after we analyze it here, then we're going to come back and we're going to say, well, let's do the same tax, but let's apply it to the consumers of the same good in the marketplace. Let's tax the consumers like when they pay for it at the final retail establishment. Let's tax them instead. And then we're going to compare the differences between the two. And one of the reasons for doing that is because, a lot of times you say, well, we're going to put a tax on, automobiles, for example. And they say, we're going to tax the producers of the automobiles, the government might say. And you might say, oh, well, that's good, because then they're going to pay tax. I don't have to worry about it. Well, you're going to learn in a second that you have to worry about that if you're a consumer in the marketplace. All right, so let's start with production. In the diagram, we have a demand and supply curve and an initial equilibrium at P0 and Q0. Okay, so this is a product market, and this might be something like gasoline. Okay, now the government comes along and decides to put a tax on gasoline. Now, the tax rate is going to be given as the following value. T for the tax itself, it's measured in dollars per pound. We're going to have to make that gallons, but bear with me. So let's change that to gallons because I made it gasoline. Let's change that to gallons. Okay, now I'm going to talk about gallons instead. Now, the tax itself, in the diagram, the tax is going to be given by this distance right here. It's listed right there. Okay, and it's going to be the difference between these two terms, P-cons and P-prod, which will have more meaning in just a second. All right, but it's just some tax at some value. Remember that taxes being measured in dollars per unit is measured as a vertical distance along the vertical axis because that's where we're measuring dollars per pound or dollars per gallon. All right, now originally to induce production of Q1, so let's just start with a fixed point, Q1 unit of output. In order to induce that much production, producers have to get this price, P-prod. So P-prod is going to be the price that needs to prevail for producers in order to induce them to produce Q1. Right, but what if they're assessed the tax? So they're saying, okay, well, you can produce Q1 at the price P-prod, but we're going to tax you an additional T amount measured on the vertical axis by this distance. That means that in order to get producers now to produce Q1, you're actually going to have to, with the tax included, you're going to have to get in the marketplace the price P-con, because P-cons is going to be this higher price, which then when you pay the tax, you're going to end up receiving as a producer P-prod. And then you're going to be inclined to produce Q1. In other words, in order for producers to produce Q1, you're going to have to generate a market price of P-cons up here. And that's going to be true at any quantity. We pick another quantity over here. In order to get producers to produce this quantity, Q2, you're going to need to get a price here. But the tax is going to mean that they're going to end up over here. They're going to need a much higher price in order to generate that particular quantity, Q0. So in essence, we can imagine that the supply curve is shifted upward to S prime as a result of the tax that's being applied to the producers in the marketplace. Slide. So supply curve S prime is shifted up by T. So you shift vertically up by the amount of the tax to reflect the extra tax that must be paid by producers. All right, now, important, S prime is a function of what we would call the market price now, sort of what you see on the sticker when you go into the marketplace. S prime is a function of that. The intersection of S prime with the original demand curve is going to determine the market price called P-cons, okay, and the quantity, which is going to be Q1. If you put that tax in place and the supply curve shifts up, new market price is going to be P-cons, producers are going to produce Q1 at that new equilibrium. All right, but firms do not receive the market price, right? Because they have to pay the tax. So they receive P-cons at the market, then they turn over this T amount to the government, and they end up receiving P-prod. P-prod is the amount that the producers go home with, right, after paying the tax. And then that's what induces them to produce the Q1. All right, now, P-cons, definition. P-cons is the market price, or what I'm going to call it, the consumer price, the price paid by consumers in the marketplace. It's going to be the price on the price tag, we might say. Right, so that's what consumers are going to see and what they have to pay to get out of the store with the product in their hand. That's P-cons. P-prod, on the other hand, is going to be used to define or refer to the price that's received by the producers after paying the tax in this case. Right, so they don't go home with P-cons. They have to pay the government. So they're going to go home only with P-prod instead. So what's the effect of this tax in this particular case? The effect is quite clear. Consumer price, the price in the marketplace, is going to rise because of the tax. Producer price, the price received by producers, P-prod, is going to fall relative to P0, the initial price. Right? And the quantity traded is going to change from Q0 to Q1. It's going to fall. And that's what we should expect to happen with a tax. A tax should discourage the activity at hand. It does indeed. Quantity traded in the market is reduced. And it's reduced because the prices are split apart between consumers and producers. Now notice, production and consumption prices are different, but the quantity consumed, Q1, is exactly equal to the quantity produced, which is Q1. The quantities still have to be equal to each other in the marketplace. Next, let's do exactly the same exercise, but now we're going to do the tax on consumption instead. Okay, so forget this S prime now. We're going to imagine that instead this tax of P dollars per gallon is imposed on consumption in the market instead. Right now, in the diagram again, T is still the same difference between P-cons and P-prod. That's just helps us in this analysis, you'll see. And originally, to induce the consumption of Q1, consumers have to get the price P-cons in the market. So in order to induce Q1 worth of demand, the price in the marketplace has to be P-cons. That's what you have to pay to get out the door, basically. Okay, but with the tax, consumers have to pay T on top of this P-con. So take the price they have to pay, subtract off the amount that they have to pay, and this is what producers are going to end up receiving instead. Okay, and that's going to induce a lower quantity produced as well. Now, you can imagine then that what's going to happen if you charge the consumers this tax is that the demand curve is going to shift downward to D prime. Right? And this is either the supply curve shifts up and we do the analysis that way, or the demand curve shifts down and we do the analysis that way. It's not both of them. You don't do both of these simultaneously, really. Now, with D prime shifted down, D prime is a function now of the pre-tax or the producer price in the market. So it's not a function of the market price that consumers pay. It's a function of the producer price that producers receive. So when you find the intersection of D prime with supply, it's going to determine a different price than the intersection of supply and it's S prime and D. In this case, it's going to determine the producer price instead. And then you have to take that price, carry it up to the demand curve, to figure out what the consumer price is going to be. Okay, but D shifts down by the amount of the tax, same as S shifted up before by the amount of the tax. They determine then different prices depending on which of these you shift. But what about the final result? The final result, if you ask the consumers to pay the tax, is that the consumer price with the tax is going to rise up to P-cons just like before. The producer price is going to fall just like before. So consumer prices are going to rise, producer prices fall, and the quantity traded is going to fall with the tax that you assess on consumers now instead of producers. What does that mean? Equivalence. Production and consumption tax, no matter how you assess it in the marketplace. And again, this is a perfectly competitive market because we've got an upward sloping supply curve, and that's what we're describing in this kind of a setting. A perfectly competitive market, a production tax on a product is equivalent to a consumption tax on the same product. It doesn't matter who you tax. Price changes for producers and consumers are going to change equivalently. And there's a better way, I think, to analyze the effect of this tax now in this diagram. Forget about S prime. Forget about D prime. You don't need to use those at all. I think they're problematic because they're confusing. You've got to keep track of how this curve shifted in this way. Which price is this a function of now? Which price is being determined by the new intersection? It can be very confusing. So what I choose to do is to give another technique for how we evaluate the effects in the marketplace. And that other technique is to do the following. Right here. Find a quantity Q such that the vertical distance between demand and supply is equal to the tax. Okay, in this particular case, the vertical distance here is the tax. So you take that vertical distance and you find a quantity where the difference between demand and supply, again, vertically distant, is going to be equal to that tax. Notice this quantity here doesn't do it. It's too small. This quantity here is too big. The difference between demand and supply vertically, again, okay, that difference between this point here and this point here is too big, match T. But this point here, Q1, is actually splitting demand and supply by exactly the amount of the tax that's being assessed. So find the tax first, what's being charged, and bring it to the demand and supply curve and find, again, a quantity where the vertical distance is equal to that tax. That's how you're going to find the new producer and consumer price that's going to prevail in the marketplace. A higher price on the demand curve is going to be the price paid by consumers, P-con. The lower price you find on the supply curve is going to be the price that's received by producers, what we call P-prod. And so we don't have to shift supply and demand. It doesn't matter. It's going to give us the same result anyway. Now notice the following. Tax is going to drive a wedge between P-cons and P-prod. It's going to separate them apart. Relative to P0, the initial price, consumers are going to pay higher prices than that. Relative to P0, producers are going to receive lower prices than that. Difference in prices have to be equal to the tax that's being assessed. And quantity of supply at the lower producer price, P-prod, has to be equal to the quantity demanded at the higher consumer price, P-cons. And that on the diagram is equal to Q1. Now notice, bigger the tax, bigger the wedge, the lower the quantity. Let's say I put another tax into place, let's call it T2, and that tax is this distance instead, much bigger. Well, where would that give us a new equilibrium? Well, we take that distance and we find the vertical distance that's equal to that particular distance there, maybe about that. Okay, that's about the same as T2. That means that the quantity is going to fall further to Q2. And it means that the producer price is going to be lower, P2 prod. And the consumer price is going to be higher, P cons 2. Right? So the bigger the tax, the smaller the quantity, the bigger the difference between the consumer and the producer price, the bigger the wedge, so to speak. Right? And that's what we're going to get. Now, if you have a smaller tax, like this one here, you're going to find the quantity much closer to the free trade or free market equilibrium with no tax in place. So a small tax reduces quantity a little bit. A big tax reduces it further and further and further. Okay, so that's how we can analyze the price and quantity effects of a tax on this particular diagram. Welfare effects. We really want to see in the end is not just how does the price change, how does the quantity change, but we want to know how the individuals participating in the market are being affected as a result of this tax. Okay, and we can do that using our mechanisms now of producer and consumer surplus. Right now, remember that in the marketplace at P0 and at the original quantity Q0, before the tax is put into place, what is the before tax welfare? Well, consumer surplus is going to be given by the area between the price that prevails in the market, P0, demand curve, and the vertical axis. So it's going to be equal to A plus B plus C. Producer surplus is given by the area above the supply curve to the price. So P0 is the price, the supply curve is here, the vertical axis is there. So the producer surplus, the short-run profits and payments to fixed costs, are going to be given by areas D plus E plus F. Remember, these letters correspond to the area of the shape that it happens to be sitting in on the diagram. Surplus effects are measured by areas on the graph. Taxes are measured by vertical distances here. Quantities are measured by horizontal distances here. When we multiply price and quantity together, we get dollar values, which is what all of these areas inside the diagram correspond to. So this is consumer surplus measured in dollars, producer surplus measured in dollars. If we ask, what is the market welfare? We just add them up. It's going to be A plus B plus C plus D plus E plus F. So market welfare is going to be the summation of all of the surplus that's being earned in that marketplace because of sales taking place at the price P0 and the quantity Q0. It's all those happiness bursts that are accruing to the Smith & Joneses that are coming together and trading this particular product in exchange for money. But now, let's put the tax into place. Changes in welfare. So we're going to look at the change in welfare from the tax. So now, the original equilibrium is the price P0. To analyze the change in consumer and producer surplus, we have to ask, well, in the new equilibrium with the tax imposed, what is the new price for consumers? And then how does that affect consumer surplus? So the price for consumers goes from P0 up to P cons. As a result, consumer surplus goes from ABC to just A. Consumers lose because they have to pay a higher price and because they get a lower quantity of this good than they did before. On this diagram, we can measure how much they lose in dollar value. The loss is going to be corresponding to minus area B plus area C. Okay? What about producer surplus? Producers originally were getting the surplus area DEF, but the price for producers falls to P prod. They get a lower price after the tax is imposed. So as a result, producer surplus falls to area F. That means producers lose areas D plus E. So the tax is actually affecting both the consumers in the market by some amount. They're getting less total surplus, and producers are getting less profit as a result of the tax. All of this leads to a loss overall in the marketplace. But there's a positive effect from the tax. The positive effect is the tax revenue that's coming into the government, and then the government uses that money to spend on public goods, social programs, transfers money to somebody. Somebody is getting the benefit of the revenue that's going to the government. I don't really want to say the government benefits from that because I'm presuming it's not going into the hands of government officials. Instead, it's going into the revenue stream, which is then being used to provide, public goods that are provided by the government. It's helping finance our police and fire and military and things like that. How much is it? It's going to be equal to the tax, which I've said is equal to value T dollars per gallon. And you're going to have to multiply that by the quantity that's traded, which is Q1. Q1 is this horizontal distance right here, because that's 0. Q1 is this distance then. And T is given by this distance between P prod and P cons. So it's going to be equal to areas B plus D. This is a positive effect for the economy. Money comes into the government, they spend it for good things, presumably, and those good things accrue to people within the economy. So we want to count that. All right, what is the total market welfare? MW stands for market welfare. The total effect is going to be, notice the following. Minus B and plus B cancel out. Minus D and plus D cancel out. And we're going to be left with a market welfare effect of minus C minus E. The net effect on welfare is negative. The tax causes a loss to the economy overall. Let's think about why. Those net negative effects, the minus C minus E that we had before, so C and E, those net negative effects are called deadweight losses by economists oftentimes. So learn that term. They're also called efficiency, economic efficiency losses. And in fact, we can actually go back. Since this C is this little triangle that appears next to the demand curve, we would call this a consumption efficiency loss. This area E is next to the supply curve here, and we're going to call that a production efficiency loss. All right, so there's efficiency losses corresponding to this loss because of the tax. So we're losing economic efficiency because the tax is imposed. Now, why? What's going on? Remember that the height of the demand curve is representing the willingness to pay on the part of consumers. And the height of the supply curve vertically is measuring the willingness to sell. And the difference between the two corresponds to the surplus that's being split up between the supplier of the good and the consumer of the good. But what's happening here? What's really happening is that we're losing a bunch of trades that would have been favorable and would have been possible before the tax. The tax is discouraging the trades that generate surplus that's less than the amount of the tax. And because it's eliminating all of these trades right here, it's eliminating all of this consumer surplus and all of this producer surplus. So you're basically eliminating some positive benefits that would have accrued to individuals had they been allowed to trade at the free market price P0. And that's why we get efficiency losses as a result of the tax. Now, we are measuring the fact that that tax generates revenues. We're counting those revenues as a good thing for the economy overall. But even despite the benefits on the tax revenue, we're actually ending up with a net negative effect for the economy or for the market overall. And it's that reason why a tax can be thought of as being detrimental for the economic system. Taxes discourage this activity, which would have been favorable from the consumer's perspective, and we're eliminating some portion of those trades because of the tax that's being put into place. Now, a little bit later in the course, in a few weeks, we're going to be giving some specific reasons for using that tax, like, for example, to clean up pollution in a particular industry. We're going to think about those offsetting effects of pollution. When we do that analysis later, we're going to come up with an argument for why the tax can actually lead to an improvement in economic efficiency. We have to have that ulterior other reason to include in order to talk about that. We'll get to that. Right now, we're talking about the effects of the tax in a so-called perfectly competitive market setting. So this is a market where there are no imperfections, no problems to correct for. When we have a tax in that circumstance, the effect is that it doesn't help the market at all. It's actually reducing market welfare. It's hurting producers, it's hurting consumers, and it's benefiting the government to some degree. But the net effects are nevertheless negative because of the tax. There's an argument then for why government intervention be detrimental to the economy and to society. Okay, hold on to that. It's not the end of the story. We've got a lot more to tell about that.